we're going to start having a little town hall here. And if we would have not been arrested for doing so, during the pandemic, one of the things that came up, one of the questions that came up was, well, wait a minute, the governor of the state has just made a law that makes it a crime for 2 or more people to be in this church right now on Sunday. What does the Bible say? We're supposed to not forsake what? And so as a matter of religious freedom and conscience, unalienable right, 2 things. Government, where did you get the authority to make that law? And the governor did not have an answer, so she literally made something up that it just wasn't true. But let's assume that there was some authority allowing them. You're still using the law that is interfering with a fundamental liberty, that is freedom of speech of a pastor, the free exercise of religion, as protected by the Michigan and the U.S. Constitution. Okay, with that framework, pastors put together a question. In particular, pastor I love wrote 20 questions. And you have a blue packet. Everybody has one. Please make sure that you take that home because it's packed with resources. There are facility use policies. There's just all kinds of information in there if you're a pastor or you're a ministry on how to deal with some of the cultural things. And can you pull out the 20 question ones in there? It's right on top. So why don't someone just start this out with a question? Anybody have a question over the corner here? Yeah.
Generally, if they're allowed with their club to use the building after hours, they're pretty happy with that. But I know in some places they do things during like lunch breaks or even a optional class in the building. And just curious if that's something, because those are programs that are running here in Kent County, and sometimes the churches are afraid to get involved because of the potential blowback. So.
First of all, if a government school opens up its facility to different groups to use, they can do that. What they can't do is, if they open up their facility for different groups to use, is exclude Christian groups or groups that have a Christian message. And very strong U.S. constitutional law. We've got cases that, that exact example went to the Supreme Court. And so what you don't want to do, if you're a public school, is say, we're going to have such and such a socialist whatever for the future of whatever group allowed, but we're not going to allow, Oakhill Church to do a Bible study. And so it's amazing what rights Christians have that are not exercised, and what public schools can even do, and what they're allowed to do that they don't do, either because they aren't aware of it or they're not inclined to. Now, that being said, let me flip the story around and change the question a little bit. Now you're a church. Now you're not the school. Now you're a church, and you do you do weddings, and you marry people within your faith and in your church. You with me so far? And you've got a statement of faith about what marriage is and everything. Let's say that, and members who ascribe to that statement of faith you marry them as part of your church. And a good pastor, I'm sure, does some good counseling ahead of time and all the things that go on with that. But let's say times are hard, and you're not quite able to pay the heat bill. And so you say, well, maybe I can bring in some extra money by performing marriages, and I'll just put myself out there, and for $300, $250, I'll marry somebody. And so you put that out there, and now you start to have folks come in that somebody comes in with their cat and says, I want to marry my cat because I identify as a furry. Or two men come in and they want to be married, or something inconsistent with your faith. Well, here's the problem with what you did earlier. There's something called public accommodation laws that prohibit discrimination based on race, based on religion, based on sex, and now in Michigan based on all these other additional categories. All right? But they apply to public accommodations like McDonald's. And so when McDonald's hires somebody or makes a policy, they can't make a policy that discriminates based on those different categories because they're a public accommodation. People come in and buy hamburgers, and they're supposed to sell hamburgers to anybody that comes in the door. Well, what you did when you changed your marriage policy at the church is you just turned your church into a McDonald's. You just changed it from a religious institution to a public accommodation. And so, whereas before, when your church was, and your marriage policy was grounded in your statement of faith and grounded in, and who you married was grounded in the Bible and grounded in biblical principles and grounded in your statement of faith, you now changed that over and made it an economic commercial model. And therefore, the government doesn't look at your church anymore with regard to those anti-discrimination laws as a church. Now it looks at you as a McDonald's, as a public accommodation. Because you've opened it up to everybody, you've got to do that. So does it matter on what your policies are with your church? Does it matter that you have a statement of faith? Absolutely. Absolutely, because if you don't have it, you don't have the protection of the Constitution. You don't have the protection of the laws. And so if you do have it, that's not going to necessarily stop some unethical or corrupt government official from engaging in lawfare against your church. But guess what? Hopefully they're going to lose. Hopefully they're going to lose. And you're going to be... we still live in this great country that has this great, constitutional protection. One of the reasons I think the other side is so fierce about trying to undermine our Constitution is because if they can get rid of it, then we don't have those protections anymore. So not only do we need to contend for the faith, and this isn't biblical, but I think this is at least patriotic. We need to contend for the nation. And so when I say that, we need to contend for the constitutional principles that made this country so great, that allows for us to share the good news of Jesus with the next generation. Other questions? Somebody over here had a question. Yeah.
My question is more along the lines of how to respond. So you brought up a great example about COVID and our governor not really having law behind her to institute what she did during COVID. I have a mother that's 4'8", 92 years old. She's been accosted at churches for, standing up for her faith. I've had, great example, the young man that was wearing, I think, a Jesus Saves t-shirt in a mall, and he was asked to leave. He couldn't wear a shirt. So I know we're supposed to turn the other cheek, but then how do you respond? I mean, how do you stand up for your rights? How do you respond to this type of stuff?
I'll repeat the question. the question was, how do you respond when somebody is challenging you or worse, attacking you, for your faith? How do you respond? Like when she used the example of the governor. We responded very assertively, but compassionately, with gentleness, with respect to the office, that she held, and said, "This is what the law is. We would like you to have your actions conform. It's my understanding that the Speaker of the House and the Leader of the Senate likewise, had discussions that were very specific as to that." And the governor basically said, "Too bad." Yeah. All right. I continued to be respectful. I continued to show compassion. I continued to be gentle with regard to my demeanor. But we then said, well, if that's your position, then the next thing within our constitutional republic, since conversation wasn't helpful, we then went to the federal courts and said, government action, you can't go to church, or more than 2 people can't be in a church, or it's crime. Constitutional principle, the free exercise of religion is an unalienable fundamental liberty that limits the exercise of government power. This exercise of government power prohibits the free exercise of religious faith. Therefore, this exercise of government power is unconstitutional. Governor then said, fine. I'm going to make you spend a lot of money. And so the next thing we did, again, maybe with a little less gentleness and respect, we went to the media. And then the media told the people in the state. The Detroit News did an article, and all of a sudden the whole state, everybody that went to church in the state knew what was happening. Now all of a sudden, because, and this is kind of interesting. I told you a story about Florida. If you live far enough south, or I lived in Africa for a long time, you get to have a personal relationship, not with just your Lord and Savior, but with your local cockroaches that are residents with you. They're not fun, but you just get, it's part of life. And I tell you what, if you ever come in at night down in Florida or in Africa and you turn on a light, the cockroaches are there and they scramble. And that's just like government acting corruptly. They don't like to have the light of truth shined on them, and they scramble. And so you asked what to do. I'm showing you how we always try to de-escalate. And the last thing we want to do is go to court, but we continue to escalate, always following biblical principles in doing so. Not one time did you ever see me, call the governor even by name or a name. I respected the office and was holding the person that was acting inappropriately accountable. And we escalated until, and that's all it took. Your lawsuit wasn't enough, but once people knew about the lawsuit, immediately she rescinded that part of the order. Yes?
The young man, could he have just responded, this is my right, and I'm not going to leave them alone, I'm going to continue to wear my t-shirt?
Well, and with regard to, I had a t-shirt case. Somebody was wearing a t-shirt that said, Jesus is good, or I can't remember what it was, Jesus is the way, or something. And she was removed from her government position. I think it was an election poll watcher, poll thing, whatever, and was fired. But other people wearing other kinds of T-shirts with other messages were allowed, to continue working. And so, most of the time, again, to answer your question, is you want to start by having a conversation. Sometimes you might want to have a lawyer having the conversation, During the pandemic, I helped thousands of people who had lost their job or their scholarship was being thrown out. And again, the Constitution applies to government, not private companies. And so when it was a government university, what I would do, and again, I'm thinking like a Christian, what would Jesus do here? I called up the general counsel of the University of Michigan, or I called up the general counsel of whatever the university that was doing this, and I say, you may not be aware, but one of your employees is, and as you know, they're a government actor because they're working for the government university. This is what they are doing. Okay? And will you do me a favor, University of Michigan, go talk to your smartest constitutional law professor, then go to the most expensive constitutional lawyer you can find, tell them what you're doing, and then call me back. See, I didn't threaten a lawsuit there, but they knew by the way and the demeanor that I held, they didn't even have to call the guy to know what they were doing was wrong, because most lawyers wouldn't have done it that way. And we resolved, I would say 90-some% of the cases that way, because once they knew one of their employees was doing something wrong, and it's not because, I would like to think it's because, we want to do the right thing, so we're going to fix this. But I think most of the time it was we don't want to be sued. But I don't care what it was, the Lord used it. And after about 2 years of that, from 7:30 in the morning till very late at night, phone calls coming with people crying, and I've lost my job, I've lost this. I was about at a breaking point myself, because I found what purpose was I having? I was helping these people, but what was being accomplished in all this ultimately? People were keeping their jobs and they were keeping their scholarships, but what in society was being... And then all of a sudden, I don't know if it was Marilyn or who it was, but all of a sudden it occurred to me that every one of these thousands of people, they were brilliant. Some of them were neurosurgeons and nurses and doctors and PhDs, and they were all just some of the very top people of these, and all of a sudden I realized that these boards that they had to go before to ask for their accommodation or their exemption from the vaccine, their religious accommodation, they were sharing their testimonies. And so a neurosurgeon was sharing his Christian testimony with somebody who probably otherwise never would have heard the Word of God. And one person after another, and then I realized, there's thousands that are doing this. Yes. And so don't tell me that God doesn't take something they designed for good or bad and turn something good. But to answer your question, the Bible also says that we are to be prepared to give an answer, for the hope that we have. And then the verse that follows that, it says we're supposed to do it with gentleness and respect. So first thing, really be in our Bible every day so that we are able to give an answer. And again, I've got lawyer DNA in me. That's not necessarily, nice DNA. My first instinct is to fight. My first instinct isn't to be gentle and respectful. But the Bible commands that. And the reason that it does is that it works. It works. It's powerful. And then when it doesn't work, guess what? God gets glorified anyways. Because when corruption is allowed to prevail, the evil and the unfairness of it is seen by the rest of the world. And so we may not have won that particular battle, but we just advanced the kingdom in a very huge way.
Okay, back to your last, what you were talking about, the church being used for other things other than, when they let outside groups come in.
Right.
So my question is, this statement about a public accommodation. I found that fascinating. Does that mean if you don't charge groups to come in, is that only if you charge groups to come in? If you don't charge a group to come in, if they're allowed to use your facility, do you then become a public
No,
accommodation
you're still a
in
public
the law?
accommodation, yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you.
Other questions?
I just want to know what we can and can't do in the schools as far as encouraging kids and getting Bible clubs started in the public schools, or, yeah, what can we do and what is constitutional and not constitutional, and how to do it appropriately.
And more in depth to the answer I'm about to give you is in that blue packet. And there's incredible things. Again, if the school is opening up its, facilities and its classrooms after hour to other groups, you can have a Bible study there. That's the Goodwill's Club case. But you can also have release time. Schools can release their students for an hour, and they can go out and get biblical teaching under the local pastor and have them then brought back. Yeah.
So we've been given access to one of the schools by the superintendent. So we have a room that we're being charged for to rent, but we're not allowed to talk to the students at all. And so that's kind of counterproductive, and I'm trying to figure out.
Well, it depends on what are you renting the room for?
To get a Bible club started and for a prayer
For the
club
students?
to encourage the students. Yep.
Oh, well, tell them that's what you want to do it for then.
They know that.
Well, then why are they saying they can't talk to the students? Why are they letting you have the room if they can't talk to the students?
Exactly. I'm not the
Do
head of
they
this.
open the room up to other classes, other people too, or?
I don't
See,
know.
that's what
I'm
you
not
need
the
to
head
know.
of it. I'm helping someone
Yeah.
with it.
See, if they say nobody can come, then they can say nobody can come. But once they've opened it up, and if you've got, I don't care if you've got a science club or an LGBTQ club or a gay straight alliance club or a horticulture club, whatever you have, if they're allowing for that, you can have a Bible club.
Well, and we want to do it appropriately, respectfully, gently. We want to build a relationship with them as well. We don't want to get,
Right, but what they want, Deb,
Yeah,
what the school
but-
wants is it to be student-led.
Right.
That's the issue. So you got to train up these kids in the church and send them in.
But we
Yeah.
can't talk to the students to get a student-led organization, so there's the
Well,
thing.
then you got a problem, because
Right.
if you're not, then
They're not letting us.
you've got to have some student at least that wants to start this thing.
Exactly, so we're praying for that, but.
So, yeah. Usually that's how they start, is you've got at least one family or something that.
Right.
So I've got a couple of big questions here that I get from pastors and leaders all the time. So if you don't mind, and these came from pastors. So I'm going to ask a couple of them and then answer them, because the question about the 501c3 status. First of all, under IRS policy, not my policy, but under IRS policy, you do not have to be, a 501c3 to benefit from the tax exempt status. Why? Because the First Amendment trumps everything. You free exercise of religious conscience. Now, the reason that, people have, not saying you shouldn't do that or should do that, that's up to each church and their elders to decide on how to do that. The reason that some churches do that just makes the process easier for the tax exempt status of, the taxpayer who's donating to the church. And, you've got, though, the interesting thing is, though, the IRS actually does recognize, that you don't have to, apply for that nonprofit tax exempt status in order to receive the benefits. Now, what does that 501c3 statute say with regard to nonprofit ministries and churches when you are one? Well, one of the things you're not supposed to do is endorse candidates. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be up. It doesn't mean, first of all, that you should, well, I don't even think it means you shouldn't endorse candidates, so hang on to that for a second. But let me tell you what it certainly doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that you can't get up and give a sermon like you just heard earlier today and then start preaching the word on how it applies to any particular policy that's before the state legislature or county commission board or township board. You know, that's what the church is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be speaking, you know, into the culture. And I would suggest, and I'm not giving you legal advice here to do this, but I would suggest that the provision of 501c3 statute that says you're not supposed to endorse candidates is unconstitutional. Because a pastor has freedom of speech, a pastor has the free exercise of religious conscience. And what's that? What are we talking about when we talk about 501c3 statute? It is a law that was passed by who? The government. And so the government is acting. The government is therefore using power. So the second question you ask then is, where'd you get the power is the first question. They'll say the tax and spending power. Okay. So the second question is, and let's just get to the second question is, even if you've got a legitimate power, which is questionable, does the free exercise of religion and freedom of speech stop the government from interfering with that fundamental right? And the answer, in my view, is absolutely. And again, I'm not giving you legal advice to do that, because if you do that, can I promise you the IRS agents won't show up and try and make an example of you? No, I can't promise that. What I can tell you, in the history of the United States, I'm only aware of one time or so that ever happened. So I think the IRS even knows that what I just said is true.
That's right. Amen.
Question? Or are you just saying hello? You know, even under their laws, even under the 501c3 statute, a pastor can walk outside of a church and, as an individual citizen, then certainly, you know, endorse, you know, whoever, you know, he wants to endorse as well. Again, you know, everything I said earlier still applies. Yeah. Question in the back? Question?
I got a quick question for you, William. I don't know if it's in the back.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question about Proposal 3. I mean, I think it's the worst piece of legislation in Michigan history. What can and should the church or any Christians or anybody do about Proposal 3? I mean, at this point, is it something that can be litigated, dealt with locally? Is it something that could move to the Supreme Court? Or do we just sit back and let it go, barring whatever? Any thoughts on that?
The answer is yes, you can litigate, and the answer is yes. I represent right now, I have the highest privilege of anything I've ever done in my legal career. I am representing an unborn child in the womb that's alive right now. And we're representing the largest association of pro-life physicians, the largest association of Christian physicians and other medical professionals. We're representing parents of children who are in school right now, who the government is now telling the teachers that they have to assist with the abortion and not tell the parents. So we've got this we are representing children who were conceived in rape and were born alive and are alive today. And so we've got this huge group of plaintiffs that I and this other lawyer represent, and we have gone to federal court, and because the U.S. the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so the specific answer to your question is yes, you can litigate, yes, you have to rely on the rule of law to do that, because what they're arguing is that this new Prop 3, this new constitutional provision in the Michigan Constitution allows for all that. It allows for abortion all the way to after the baby is coming out of the womb. Yes. It allows for the doctor to kill the baby, allow the baby to die after it's born, and have complete immunity. That used to be called infanticide in this country. We believe it allows for, children through government counselors at school to have, medical procedures to change, to supposedly change their sex irreversibly without the consent or knowledge of parents. And there's reason to believe that the Michigan Constitution in Prop 3 does just that because the people of the state of Michigan voted for it. What can we do about it? Well, the U.S. Constitution says that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land. So if the Constitution of the United States conflicts with what Michigan did, then the Constitution of the United States prevails. Right. And we are arguing in federal court the following things. Number one, and this isn't our main argument, but one of the things we're arguing is that in the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Constitution guarantees to each one of us, and it's called the Guarantee Clause, guarantees a Republican form of government. That is a representative form of government, a kind of government that we have come to know where we don't have a democracy, we have a democratic republic. We, through a democratic process, elect representatives who make public policy. The reason the framers guaranteed that every state would have that kind of representative governance is they knew exactly what would happen if you let a runaway mob mentality with press that misrepresented what was going on, what would happen. They completely foresaw this Prop 3 debacle, which is why they guaranteed that all public policy of this kind of magnitude is to be made through representative governance, not through a democracy initiative. And so the whole thing should fall because of that. But there's, in the category of what man determined for, bad, God could use for good, this case allows us for the first time to say that that unborn child in the womb is a person worthy of dignity and worthy of being protected by our Constitution. And so if that child in the womb is a person, then the due process clause of the Constitution matters, and you can't take a person's life without due process. You can't, and part of what the other side did that was so horrendous but also so helpful is they literally put into Michigan constitutional law infanticide and through government authorized infanticide, saying that the doctor, is immune from any kind of prosecution or civil suit. And so it's an uphill battle, and here's why it's an uphill battle. We didn't want to wait. This case would have been much stronger the first time I could have taken a baby that was murdered after it was born and put the pictures in front of a jury and said, this is what happened. This case would have been much stronger if somebody's child had been surgery or had a child aborted without their knowledge or consent. And the reason it would have been much stronger is, remember I told you the federal government has a constitutional role to decide cases and controversies? That's their role. There actually has to be a case in controversy. Somebody actually has to be injured, or they say that you don't have standing to come before the court because you haven't had something bad happen to you. Therefore, there's not a controversy in front of us. And so there's a possibility that we could lose this case, not ultimately lose it, in the sense that there's a chance that the court may not decide the hard questions and may punt by saying your plaintiffs are sympathetic, but they actually haven't been harmed yet. Nobody took that child and aborted that child. Nobody took that And so we didn't want to wait for the horrendous to happen to make our case stronger. We've got legitimate arguments, and there's cause to believe that we can overcome the standing question, but that's where we're at. And the answer to your question is somebody had to do something. And somebody else needs to do this, but the answer to your question is something like this costs $100,000. I mean, it costs that much to take that case, and that's not even to the Supreme Court. Right. You know, that's if we have a full trial, and we're doing this no matter what. Right. But if somebody wants to support that, they can. I didn't come here. This is not a fundraiser. You asked the question. I would not have asked. I would not have said this otherwise. But something like this costs $85,000 to $100,000 to get through the process, and that's not even talking about each time I do a brief in the U.S. Supreme Court. We just we've done over 50 cases. We've participated in over 50 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. I just find out the lawyers that were doing this for this other group that I was willing to do it for were charging them $80,000 for the brief alone, just the one brief in the U.S. Supreme Court. Wow. We charge zero, nothing. Because this is for the glory of God, and it's for Him only. But that doesn't mean that there are not costs and expenses, because, you know, we need to hire lawyers, and lawyers do need to get paid. Other lawyers do. I may not, I don't take the money, but others will have to. Yeah. One more question, and then maybe some lunch. Koinonia and fellowship.
At this point in time, I don't know if I want to follow after you just spoke or not. I'd like to take it back to the C1A and C3, unincorporated and non-incorporated churches, and say that there is still an advantage. They're totally separate from the government. Their lists, their names, whatever, are all private, and there are many churches still hanging on to that.
Absolutely.
And boy, that was tough. Thank you for what you just said, what you just spoke about the children, babies, live.
Yeah. Well, let me follow up with the sentiment that you're talking about there, because once you do, for whatever advantage the government gives you, and could be for you're homeschooling your kid, and now all of a sudden you want to have them play sports or something, but you don't want to participate in the homeschool sport thing, so you go to the local. As soon as you take government money, let me tell you, even if you don't see it, there are strings attached to that money. And, you know, right now, before the Michigan legislature is a bill, I believe, designed to end Christian education in this state. There's a number of them out there, but this one in particular, there's a scholarship that they gave to the poorest of Michigan residents. You could take it to any school in Michigan, religious or not. There's a scholarship for if you get a certain grade point. Doesn't matter who you are, you get it, and you can take it any school in Michigan. Well, the proposal is to get rid of the poor scholarship, put some of that money in the grade point scholarship, and then say everybody's eligible unless you're taking it to a university that has a policy that has a statement of faith similar to this church. And then you're ineligible for that scholarship. Again, bring it on. One of the things we do at Salt.Light.Global is we try to stop that stuff before it becomes law. And even in an environment when there's hostility toward, people of faith, and the legislature isn't necessarily, and that's why you've got folks that are trying to think biblically, and churches are trying to raise up people, that would serve as public servants. So you've got people that are going to follow the law instead of make it up as they go along. But that's why it's so important that we be Salt and Light, that we go from here, that you leave here, and then, as Jesus said, go out there. And so on all these issues, one of the things that and again, we've got a big packet of resources. Go to the website, because the website is a ton more resources. We try to track everything that impacts a Christian family. And again, we're not saying vote for this or vote against it, but we will tell you this is why it's consistent with Christian principles. This is why it's not consistent with Christian principles. Now, be a citizen and do what citizens do. Any other before we? Yes.
In your resources, being a citizen, I'm getting questions from people now who are in congregations where the pastors are apolitical, they don't get involved, they don't believe it's scriptural to interact at all, and they're asking for scriptural help. How do we approach our pastor? How do we make a dent into the congregation to open their eyes? Do you have those kind of resources on your site?
There's information that would be helpful, but in that situation, I have found the only thing that works is a conversation with the pastor. And it best comes from a fully equipped member of an elder board. But I am happy, and I'm sure any of the pastors here would be happy to sit down. I was privileged, and I don't know how the Lord orchestrated this, but I found myself in the room with all the leaders of the Missouri Senate. Well, I probably shouldn't have said who they are, but, well, it's out. So the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, who are pretty much, they follow, for the most part, follow the Word of God, all right? We may disagree, but they had this idea that, and this was all of the churches in, I think, the United States and Canada, and these pastors. And I'm doing 2 days of answering questions like you just asked. And one of the first questions was, well, Jesus brought out a denarius, brought out that coin, didn't he? And he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God's what is God's. We shouldn't be talking about the culture. That's politics. That's government. And I don't know where this came from, because I'm just not that smart. The Lord just gave it to me. Sometimes it just happens that way. The question just automatically came out. I said, well, who's the government? I said, who's the government? We the people. And the government in Canada and the government in the United States is we the people. And I said, so now when we're talking about, so now doesn't the church now have not just the responsibility, but the duty to be speaking, into the culture? What you're really saying is you don't want to talk about the uncomfortable things like abortion, because you'd probably have no problem getting up and giving a sermon about child trafficking and why that was bad. You'd probably have no problem about getting up and giving a sermon through a biblical worldview about poverty, because that is bad. But why should you then have a problem getting up and talking about the dignity of human life that God created? Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable. And all of a sudden, I don't know what happened, but that room transformed. And the answer, I think, to your question is, you can have all the information in the world, but if you don't change the heart of the pastor, because the pastor doesn't have any malevolence. Sometimes they're either just afraid, or sometimes they think they're doing the right thing even. And I think, am I right? Yeah, I think, and if you change the heart of the pastor, in the Latin translation from the Hebrew, the word pastor means shepherd. And it's the shepherd's job to guard the flock and to lead the flock. Yes. And if the shepherd isn't, guarding the flock, there is no thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. That rod and that staff is supposed to be when they're getting off the path. That's not what's happening. The pastor's sending them out and say, go on down that path, because I'm not even going to show you where the still waters are. I'm not even going to show you where the green pastures are. You just go out and fend for yourself, and we like sheep, we've gone astray. It doesn't take very long before they're in the wrong place. Amen.